Good afternoon. This is our lesson for October 8th, beautiful fall day, and we are looking at another parable of reversal. Very much like we heard several weeks ago with the king who forgave his servant a great debt, only for the servant to turn around and not forgive another servant a smaller debt. This week's parable, while reversing what we may think of how people should act when invited to a wedding, also gives us a reversal of how a host should or does act. This is one of those parables that has a lot of separate issues to delve into that are both inviting and troubling. But before we get into the parable, I want to introduce a game. This game is called Darlin', If You Love Me, Won't You Please, Please Smile? The objective is simple. As the title implies, the goal is to get the other person to smile. You choose one person to be darlin', and that person is tasked with trying not to smile. So they can take a few seconds, deep breaths, settle themselves, but they must keep their eyes open. Everyone else is tasked with making them smile. The only rule is that you are not allowed to touch darlin', no tickling, but otherwise, one at a time, each person says, "Darlin', if you love me, won't you please, please smile?" And then they can make a funny face or use a silly voice or do wacky movements in hopes of making darlin' smile. Let everyone have a chance at being darlin'. You'll find that some people smile readily, while others can hold out through it all. I was one who always lost quickly. As soon as they started coming towards me, "Darlin', if you," I'd lose it. But the idea being that we don't always necessarily do something just because we're issued an invitation. "Darlin', if you love me, won't you please smile?" Doesn't mean we have to smile. And we don't always enjoy the obligations we do agree to. But we also need to listen to the requests of others and make decisions about whether to honor those requests, and then when we do agree, how we live up to those commitments. Our parable for this morning needs just a little background into the ancient Middle East. Throwing a party back then, some similarities, but also some differences. So when a feast like this was offered at that time, and it was a king's feast for a prince for his wedding, it was a big deal. Not just because it was a king or a prince, but because any kind of feast like that took a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of preparation, and gathering of food and supplies that were not readily on hand. So it required a lot of planning, and for a wedding feast, even more so. So 2 invitations were always sent out in such an event. The first invitation was a commitment that you would be present at the event. An RSVP, if you will, but with binding ties behind it. This invitation was sent to ensure that you would have enough food, enough seating, enough everything that was to be had. The second invitation, which is what we will hear about in the parable today, was to inform everyone who had already committed to coming that the feast was ready. So Jesus brings us into this parable already mid-story by telling us that the slaves were sent to those already invited. We immediately would know that these people had committed to attending. They had RSVP'd, and nothing short of an emergency should have kept them from coming. But we'll see that's not the case. So our parable for today comes from Matthew, the 22nd chapter, verses 1 to 14. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, "The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet." Those slaves went out to the street and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" And he was speechless. The king then said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." And on Sunday, we'll then hear the words, "This is the gospel of our Lord." So while it's a parable of reversal, we could also easily call it a parable of extremes. Everyone's reaction to everything is far too extreme and unreasonable. We start out okay in the parable with the king trying to figure out why no one would come. Their first response of not coming was not okay. They had agreed to attend, and everything about the meal was based on their attendance. So the sending of the second group of slaves was understandable and rational. The response to their arrival was absolutely not. The invitation was made light of, it said, not taken seriously. When Luke tells this parable, he says one gave the excuse that he just bought some cattle, and another some land without having seen it and he has to go see it, and another just got married recently so he can't possibly come. In other words, they give really poor excuses for not attending an event that they had already agreed to go to. But that's not the worst. Right? We hear that some of them grabbed the slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. Have we noticed that the slaves in Jesus' parables never do so very well? That's because they are a direct comment on the way the prophets were treated and the disciples will be treated. Messengers for the king or the landowner never do very well. But the thought behind it is ridiculous, right? Why would anyone kill others for bringing news of a feast? But the problem is that those slaves were actually bringing news of a responsibility, an obligation, a commitment that the people didn't want to live up to. In other words, the people are attempting to kill their own shame and guilt and lack of desire to do what the king asks. They don't want to be reminded of what they promised to do. But the king's response is also extreme and irrational. In response to the people not coming to the wedding and killing his slaves, which admittedly is way over the top, he turns around and murders them all and burns their cities. It calls me back to Jonah's desire to see Nineveh burn for all their misdeeds, or Abraham pleading with God not to rain fire down on Sodom and Gomorrah because there might be innocent people there. Whatever the reason, the king, for not having people come to a party, becomes murderous. Again, one of the issues he's left with is that he still has a full banquet with no one to eat it. That's really the problem, it seems to be. So how he thinks that will be solved with murder, how the other people thought it would be solved with murder to not go. The issue still remains, a full banquet and no one to eat it. So the invitation is now issued to anyone and everyone, the parable says, good and bad. The feast has gone from an exclusive event to an inclusive event, as long as you're wearing the right robe. What a strange ending to a strange parable. Wedding robes were expected at these kind of feasts, but very often the host, especially the wealthier hosts, such as the king, would have extra robes for those who may not be able to purchase theirs own or may have traveled from great distances. So it would seem that there was an opportunity for the person to get a robe. But that doesn't happen. And it seems that even in extending the invitation to anyone, there's still an expectation by the king that some respect is paid to the occasion, or the consequences will be quite extreme. I can't imagine being bound hand and foot because I wore the wrong thing to the wrong place. So this week, really, my thoughts on Bible study and this time and this opportunity to talk about the parables is really just to ask you, what do you make of this parable? How is the kingdom of heaven compared to this? Right? That's how Jesus starts it. The kingdom of heaven could be compared to a king who set out a feast. And if that's the case, in most of the parables, right, the king and the landowner, the vineyard owner, they are equated with God. So what images of God does this parable provoke for you? And are any of them troubling? Or are they understandable? Where do you put yourself in the parable, right? That's part of the idea of telling the parable, is to put ourselves into a situation. Who do you want to be in this parable? I will note this parable directly follows the parables of the last 2 weeks, right? The two sons, one that said he wouldn't go and did, and the other one said he would go and didn't. And then the parable from last week of the vineyard owner who tries to get his produce and the harvest, and they kill the slaves, and then they kill the second slaves, and then he sends the son and they kill the son. And then it directly ends with that story of the parable and the Pharisees realizing Jesus is talking about them into this parable. So why do you think that Jesus is spending so much time on these parables about the kingdom and about our response to the kingdom? I will note again, I mentioned a couple weeks ago, but chapter 21, which the other two parables were in, starts out with Palm Sunday, Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem, which will lead us to Holy Week, Good Friday, the resurrection, or the crucifixion. And so we're in the part of the Gospel of Matthew where we're on that final leg of Jesus' journey. So I think there is a definite reason he's concentrating so much on people's response to God and God's response to people. But frankly, today I find it a little troubling. And so I'm curious to know what you've thought about the parable, what you make from it. And I'd be happy to have you share it with me, email, or if you can join Sunday on the Zoom. But it's a very unusual parable for us to hear this week. As we finish up, I have another game, which I think is kind of fun, and especially when we look at this parable, which seems to start in a good light of a marriage feast. This game is called Reverse the Story, and all you'll need is a coin of some sort, because the first person's going to take the coin and flip it, toss it, however you want to do it. If it lands on heads, then the story is going to go in a positive, good, happy, lighthearted, however you want to look at it, direction. If it lands on tails, the story is going to go in a negative, disturbing, scary, bad, however you want to phrase that. We're going to go that direction. So once you flip the coin, the first person's going to start the story accordingly, right? Good or bad. When they have introduced a story, tell a part of it, give us some characters, start them on emotion. Then you're going to pass the coin to the next person, who is also going to flip it. Then they need to continue the story, but either good or bad, depending on their coin toss. So as you continue around the circle, or back and forth, or even with yourself, you'll find the story taking twists and turns, perhaps getting really dark, or ridiculously happy if people keep flipping the same way. And just have some fun. You can restart the story whenever. But the idea behind it is just that life sometimes feels this way, right? As if any given day, our story can flip, right? We talk about life turning on a dime. That's kind of the idea behind this, that things can go good and bad, or maybe all good and maybe all bad. And what is our response when life continues on what seems to be negative trends, or even on positive trends? And how is our response to God and our interaction with God affected by either the positive or the negative? How much control do we have in telling our story and responding to it? Just some thoughts to think. Some thoughts to think. There you go. Some thoughts to work through with the stories and the parable. I do want to mention our other lessons for this week, because I think it's rather interesting. I mentioned centuries ago, people got together and decided that we should have this kind of lectionary, this regular reading of our Gospels. And they chose to pair the Gospels with an Old Testament reading, an epistle, one of the letters from the New Testament, and then a psalm. And so you notice that's our trend most Sundays: first psalm, second, and then gospel. And this group of men decided to figure out how they thought things fit together. And so I think it's kind of funny on their choices for this coming week. Sometimes they tie beautifully in, sometimes they're stretching it. But our other lessons for this week come from the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, chapter 25, verses 1 to 9. Our New Testament reading, the epistle, is from Philippians, chapter 4, also verses 1 to 9. And though I don't know if we're going to hear it this Sunday, the psalm is the 23rd psalm that is paired with this. So we know the psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." Isaiah 25 and Philippians, what I find interesting and kind of funny is that these two passages really have a lot to do about praising and rejoicing God, especially praising Him for His mercy and His love towards us. And then, of course, Psalm 23, right? "The Lord is my shepherd." I absolutely agree with these passages. I think they are wonderful and uplifting. Philippians 4 has the "rejoice in the Lord always." And let me say it again, rejoice. What I find funny about it is we will hear "the Lord is my strength" and "great is God," and then we'll maybe hear "the Lord is my shepherd" and He leads me, and then we'll hear "rejoice in the Lord," and always I say rejoice. And then we'll get a parable where the king murders, burns, and casts out. So it's kind of a funny, I think probably they were trying to balance out this idea of this harsh parable. It really is a rather harsh parable, with the uplifting and joyful. And so as I go forward in the week, and as you go forward in the week, I would also encourage you to try to find what is uplifting and encouraging in the parable this week. So I hope you have a good couple days, and again, you're welcome to join me Sunday at 4 on Zoom to talk some more about this. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.